Welcome to the Archives of Manga History. Well, my parents' attic. I'm an underemployed millennial academic. I don't have the money to rent out any kind of archive for a video shoot. But I hope you'll nonetheless join me on a little excursion into manga history and the origins of manga. Have you ever asked yourself where manga came from? I spent a long time wondering why Euro-American comics and Japanese manga look so similar. After all, despite some stylistic differences, both use a series of drawings together with elements like motion lines and speech balloons to tell stories visually. Kinda seems like the same medium. But if you Google the origins of manga, Wikipedia will tell you that manga is said to originate from scrolls dating back to the 12th century. Huh. That's a long time ago. So is the resemblance between modern manga and comics pure coincidence? A case of convergent evolution, if you will? I couldn't find a good answer to that question in any of the research that had been published on manga. So I did what any obsessive-compulsive person would do, and I found a job at a Japanese university in order to do research over there. And I spent over 2 years looking at early manga. And spoiler alert, manga and comics actually share the same origins. The longest running manga in Japan before World War II, for example, was an American comic strip. But you'd never know that comics and manga share the same origins if you watch or read the vast majority of what's out there on the history of manga, which, like Wikipedia, will usually start with something like medieval picture scrolls to imply that manga is this continuous thing that's simply been evolving over centuries and centuries, little by little, into what it looks like today. But how did something like this turn into this? Well, it didn't. That narrative is bullshit. There's simply no connection between medieval picture scrolls and modern manga, even though that narrative keeps getting propagated, including pretty recently by the British Museum, and virtually all YouTube videos on the subject, which is why I'm making this. One big reason why the historiography of manga has been so imprecise is that most historians don't actually define what they're talking about when they say manga. It's a bit like writing a history of the internet and defining all forms of long-distance communication as the internet, and then saying something like, the first internet was carrier pigeons. That's claiming links between two things that aren't directly connected based on nothing but an overly broad definition. And just like you cannot trace a direct line from carrier pigeons to the internet, you cannot trace a direct line from medieval picture scrolls to modern manga. Which is why histories that claim that there is such a connection can't show you an actual transition from one into the other, because it doesn't exist. To be fair, however, the word manga has had different meanings historically, so let's start there. Although most histories of manga start with something like 12th century picture scrolls, the word manga itself only starts appearing in Japanese texts in the late 18th century. At the time, it meant something like sketches or drawings in general, which makes sense given that the Chinese characters that make up the word manga basically translate to loose drawings. So originally the word manga had nothing to do with storytelling or anything specific to modern manga or comics. And though you'll still find this claim repeated sometimes, the word manga also was not created by Hokusai, the guy famous for woodblock prints like the Great Wave off Kanagawa. Other people are using the word manga before Hokusai. Hokusai actually has virtually nothing to do with the history of modern manga. Often, a history claiming some sort of connection will use a funny-looking drawing by Hokusai like this, and say, see, humor, drawing, images in sequence, manga. But first of all, this isn't even a sequence, at least not a temporal one. These are 6 different guys with different patterns on their clothing. More importantly, stuff like this is a total outlier in the Hokusai manga, which generally consists of stuff like this, which makes sense given that manga to Hokusai meant sketches, but it isn't related to anything we call manga today. I've put a link to the entirety of the Hokusai manga in the video description so you can check it out in full and won't have to take my word for any of this. So there's no link between Hokusai's manga and the Japanese comics we call manga today. But then where did manga in the sense of stories told via a sequence of images come from? The history of what we call manga today starts in the late 1800s, when Japan began importing all sorts of European and American culture and technology in order to get on an equal footing with the Western imperialist powers. So he starts seeing stuff like picture stories by the German cartoonist Wilhelm Busch in Japan as early as 1887. Here's part of Busch's story The Mole, featured in a Japanese publication in 1893, for example. Such stories weren't only featured in Japanese publications, more importantly, they were imitated by Japanese artists. Here's part of Busch's story The Frog and the Two Ducks, for example, and here's part of an adaptation of it by a Japanese artist from 1889. You can clearly see the direct connection between the two and the similarity of the drawings. I put links to both the original and the adaptation in the video description so you can check them out yourself. At the time, these stories weren't called manga yet, but they popularized narratives told via multiple sequential images, which was a new thing in Japan at the time, imported from abroad along with a lot of other stuff like photography, brick buildings, or beer brewing. European cartooning also came to Japan via the foreign-born residents Charles Wergman and Georges Bigot, both of whom founded European-style humor magazines in Japan that inspired similar Japanese-run magazines, even before Wilhelm Busch's picture stories got to Japan. Charles Wergman's magazine, The Japan Punch, founded in 1862, was so influential that cartooning for a long time was primarily referred to as ponchi in Japan. Ponchi as in punch. Because remember, up until the 1890s, the word manga primarily referred to sketches in general. The influence of ponchi cartooning on narrative manga, however, was negligible, because ponchi cartoons consisted primarily of single drawings making fun of politics or society, and didn't tell stories. More important for the history of narrative manga were two Japanese cartoonists by the names of Ippyo Imaizumi and Rakuten Kitazawa. Ippyo Imaizumi went to San Francisco in the 1880s to study cartooning there. When he returned to Japan in 1890, he was employed by his uncle's newspaper, the Jiji Shimpo. In that newspaper, Imaizumi started publishing a series of so-called pantomime cartoons, which he had brought back from the United States, as well as ones that he drew himself. Pantomime cartoons, which told stories using only images and no text, had begun appearing in the United States and Europe in the mid-1800s, largely in response to the spread of photography. Here's the first such cartoon that Imaizumi published in the Jiji Shimpo in July 1890. And here's the first one that he drew himself in September 1890. Note how the English subtitle, Perpetual Motion, shows that Imaizumi saw his own cartoon in the tradition of these foreign pantomime cartoons, rather than descending from any Japanese art like picture scrolls or the Hokusai manga. This type of wordless storytelling was so new in Japan at the time that Imaizumi actually added explanatory text to these cartoons at first, even though they're completely understandable without it. These narrative multi-panel cartoons, imported and drawn by Imaizumi, were the beginning of an important shift in the meaning of the word manga. Remember that up to this point, in the early 1890s, the word manga meant random sketches like the ones Hokusai did. It was Imaizumi who repurposed this word to describe caricature, cartooning, and most importantly for our purposes, drawn narratives. The very first time that the word manga was used to describe a narrative told in pictures was with regards to one of the foreign cartoons that Ippyo Imaizumi had brought back with him from the United States. This one right here, published in April 1891. If you look at the very top, it says manga, Gaikoku Shimbun yori basui, meaning manga excerpted from a foreign newspaper, written from right to left, because back then horizontal Japanese was written right to left, which is going to be important later. So these early narrative manga from the late 1800s have absolutely no connection to Hokusai or picture scrolls. They're very much the same as European and American cartoons and picture stories from that time. And the word manga itself, as describing drawn narratives rather than sketches in general, started with Ippyo Imaizumi and a foreign cartoon. In 1902, Imaizumi was succeeded as manga editor at the Jiji Shimpo by Rakuten Kitazawa, who was also trained in Western cartooning. Kitazawa really liked the word manga, so when he started a regular cartoon supplement in the Jiji Shimpo, for which he and others drew pantomime cartoons and picture stories, he called it Jiji Manga. Because of the popularity of this supplement, the word manga, in its new meaning of cartooning and graphic narrative, gradually became a more everyday word in Japanese between 1902 and 1920. In summary, by 1920, we have cartoons and picture stories in Japan that are called manga, even if they don't quite look like the manga we know today yet. For one, there are very few speech balloons. In order to understand what happened next, we have to take a look at some developments across the Pacific. Around 1900 is when the first modern comics started appearing in American newspapers, which is going to be very important for the history of manga, so bear with me here for a bit. Before the 1890s, graphic narrative in the West primarily consisted of pantomime cartoons, i.e. completely wordless sequential images, and picture stories, i.e. sequential images explained by narrative text. But when the phonograph, the first machine that could play back recorded sound, became widespread in American society in the 1890s, cartoonists responded by incorporating depictions of sound into their drawings, such as in these cartoons here. The experience of hearing voices come out of a machine was absolutely mind-blowing for people at the time, so it became this huge thing in American society. People would even go to phonograph arcades just to experience it. Since you're listening to this video right now, you're totally used to the experience of hearing someone's voice without the person it belongs to being anywhere near you, I think. But back then, this type of thing seemed like magic. So obviously this crazy new experience provided a lot of fodder for cartoons, and that's how depictions of sound, including speech balloons, became a regular part of cartoons and comics. As a side note, word balloons, balloon shapes with text in them, had existed long before then. But those balloons were never intended as representations of sound, and one reason we know this is that before the 1890s, you can find a single graphic narrative in which characters have a conversation where they hear and respond to each other's balloons across multiple images. I'm trying to keep things relatively simple here, but there's a heap of evidence that modern comics developed directly out of cartoons related to the phonograph, and I've written a whole peer-reviewed article on that topic, which is available for free online and which I've linked to in the video description, so if you're curious about that point, please feel free to check that out. For the purposes of this video and manga history, the important thing to keep in mind is that modern comics which use speech balloons and similar devices that make visible stuff that you otherwise wouldn't be able to see in a single still image, such as motion lines and paint stars, developed in the United States around 1900. So, what does this have to do with the history of manga? A lot, actually. Rakuten Kitazawa, the guy who succeeded Ikkyo Imaizumi as manga editor at the newspaper Jiji Shimpo in 1902, was very much aware of these new developments in American cartooning, and he sometimes employed these new elements like speech balloons and motion lines and paint stars. But for some reason, Kitazawa didn't fully embrace this new form of audiovisual comics that had appeared in the United States. Here's a good example I cite in my book. This is an episode of the American comic strip Buster Brown from 1906. And in 1907, Kitazawa drew this adaptation of it for his series Tama's Tricks. Note how in Buster Brown, the characters use speech balloons to directly address one another, and there's motion emphasized by motion lines, but in Kitazawa's adaptation, these elements are absent. You have to read the external narrative text in order to understand what's going on. So from the 1890s, the term manga primarily described such picture stories and pantomime cartoons as we've seen, as well as single-panel cartoons and caricatures. There also were occasional experiments with this new audiovisual comic strip form that had appeared in the United States, but it didn't become a regular thing in Japan until 1923. That year, a Japanese newspaper editor called Bunshiro Suzuki started licensing the American comic strip Bringing Up Father for his tabloid newspaper, the Asahi Graph. This translation of Bringing Up Father was so successful that it became one of the best-known works of popular culture in all of 1920s Japan. This is evident not only from reader reactions to the strip or adaptations of it such as a musical, but also from dozens and dozens of advertisements featuring its characters, Jiggs and Maggie, appearing in Japanese newspapers throughout the 1920s, such as these here. Bringing Up Father was actually the longest-running manga in Japanese history up until World War II. Though until very recently, there wasn't a single history of manga that mentions this fact. So the history of manga is something other than random sketches, as specifically describing graphic narrative, only started in the 1890s with foreign cartoons. And the history of manga is comics which show a story in which characters are able to talk to one another using speech balloons really only started in 1923, with the longest running manga before World War II being an American comic strip. And by the way, I'm not saying this to make some kind of nationalist argument that Japanese comics are inferior to American ones. They're not. But to point out that manga and comics are fundamentally the same thing, a universal medium. My point is that claims that try to tie modern manga to medieval picture scrolls or hokusai needlessly exoticize manga, when modern manga and comics have the very same roots. If you look at the historical record, these shared roots are completely obvious. Because of the huge success of Bringing Up Father, other Japanese newspapers started featuring their own translations of American comic strips, such as Little Jimmy, Polly and Her Pals, Barney Google, Mutt and Jeff, and Happy Hooligan, to name just a few. Happy Hooligan was actually featured in Kitazawa's Jiji manga for over 5 years, making it the second longest running manga of the 1920s. Remember how Kitazawa originally hadn't fully embraced American comics? Well, after the success of Bringing Up Father, he not only licensed first Happy Hooligan and then Felix the Cat for his Jiji manga, but he also started drawing a lot of comic strips himself. Although today it's relatively simple to translate a comic strip, back then in the 1920s it was much more difficult. Because first of all, you had to have physical copies of a comic strip, then have someone able to translate colloquial English into Japanese in a way that the strip would still be funny in translation. You had to edit on paper all the sound effects and dialogue before you could make a printing plate of it. And you also had to add little notes sometimes explaining puns or cultural references that wouldn't work in translation. So from the very beginning, Japanese editors had a strong incentive to get local artists to draw original comic strips in Japanese in order to save money and avoid having to deal with the hassle of importation and translation. The first of these new domestically made manga appeared less than a month after the first Japanese episode of Bringing Up Father. That new strip was called Nonkina Tosan, often translated as Easygoing Daddy, drawn by Yutaka Aso. And we know that Aso was directly imitating Bringing Up Father because he later told people that that's what he did. His editor came up to him and said, "Draw me something like that." Nonkina Tosan even adopted Bringing Up Father's English left-to-right reading direction. Remember how earlier I said that at the time horizontal Japanese was written and read right to left? After experimenting with different approaches, the Japanese translation of Bringing Up Father eventually just kept the English reading direction in Japanese. And Yutaka Aso then copied that pattern for his Nonkina Tosan. And many of the first modern manga did the same thing, which was extremely unusual at the time, and quite ironic given that one of the things that everybody knows about manga today is that they're written and read right to left. And of course, during the 1930s, the reading direction of manga eventually settled on vertical Japanese, written and read right to left. But many of the first modern manga in the 1920s were read the exact same way as American comic strips. And regardless of reading directions, narrative manga retained the same basic form as American comics by telling stories across multiple images and featuring sound and motion within the images rather than having to narrate them. Other pre-war manga artists such as Sako Shishido, author of Speed Taro, Ryuichi Yokoyama, author of Fuku-chan, and perhaps most importantly, Suiho Tagawa, author of the massively popular Norakuro, through the popularity of these works, ensured that over the course of the 1920s and 1930s, the word manga became essentially synonymous with comics rather than picture stories. If you're interested in manga history, you've probably heard the name Osamu Tezuka before. Tezuka was born in 1928, and as a child devoured both domestically created manga by artists such as Shishido, Yokoyama, and Tagawa, as well as imported ones such as Bringing Up Father, which his own father had collected. We know this because Tezuka has mentioned this in interviews, but also because he incorporated a lot of the characters that he grew up with into his early manga, such as in this crowd scene from his early story Lost World. Here's Jiggs from Bringing Up Father, for example, and here's Aso's Easygoing Daddy. And you probably recognize a couple of other characters as well. Because of his influence and popularity, Tezuka today is sometimes portrayed as the originator of contemporary Japanese comics. But while his influence was certainly immense, especially in terms of style, his medium had already become firmly rooted in Japan before his birth, starting in 1923. The reason why Japanese comics look noticeably different from American ones today is that after World War II, and especially with the end of the American occupation of Japan, Japanese manga artists no longer looked to American comics for inspiration, while Americans continued to show little interest in Japanese comics to begin with. With the dominance of Osamu Tezuka's work, a mainstream style of manga slowly began to emerge in the post-war period. Other manga artists made more or less gradual changes to Tezuka's style, and over the years, the noses and chins got a little pointier and more simplified, for example. The large eyes that manga are famous for today are largely the result of Tezuka's love of American comic strips as well as Disney and Fleischer Studios animation. Then, in the 1980s, the English translation of Katsuhiro Otomo's Akira sparked a huge interest in Japanese manga in the United States, starting a stream of influence that this time went from Japan to the US, the opposite of the pre-war period. With the success of works like Sailor Moon, Dragon Ball Z, Naruto, Attack on Titan, and so forth, Japanese manga and anime have become a huge cultural export for Japan over the past 4 decades. So today, ironically, it is often American comics artists that are looking to Japanese ones for inspiration. Because of the several decades during which both traditions developed in relative isolation from one another, we've forgotten that manga and comics once used to be the same thing. But they were. And hopefully the evidence that I've presented in this video has at least somewhat convinced you of that. If you want to know more about the shared history of manga and comics, you should follow me on Instagram at prewar_manga, where I post and translate old manga, and you should check out my book, Comics and the Origins of Manga, which has a lot more information and images on this topic than I could fit into this video. Thank you for watching.